Welcome to your week 3 lecture. We're going to be talking about mediums and methods this week. This is a relatively long lecture, so I will try to get through it in a timely manner, but just bear with me. So we'll talk about several different mediums. So we'll start off with the drawing, kind of that basic, fundamental artistic expression. And what I want to go over is, first of all, just some of the basic vocabulary and background. Some of this is going to seem really simple, but again, it's just about kind of stripping it down, going back to the basics so that we can build up those terms, those skill sets, and those concepts, by kind of going back to the beginning. So we have this word medium that you've probably heard me say on several occasions in these lectures. And this is any material used to create a work of art. So in the plural form, we call this media. So in painting, a liquid added to paint that makes it easier to manipulate is what we call the medium. But when we're talking about medium in art in a broad sense, we might say the medium is oil on canvas. The medium is bronze. The medium is mixed media or collage. So whatever the art is made from, that is the medium. We also want to look at some just basic terms when it comes to color in art. We have pigments and we have binders, right? So pigments are the coloring agents of a medium. So this might be in pastels, for example. It might be chalk. It might be different natural materials and dyes. We have the binder then, that is the substance that holds those pigments together. So we often see this in the form of oil, for example, in paint. This little example is showing you egg, and this is tempera paint. So this was a very traditional old way of making paint was with egg, and we'll talk about tempera paint in just a little bit. So be aware of that, those terms, pigment and binder. So let's jump into drawing now, and we have pencil drawings, right? Again, very basic. I know some of this is very basic. Drawing tool made of graphite encased in a soft wood cylinder. And you can tell graphite drawings look different than, say, charcoal drawings. And when you look at these, see how smooth and detailed those graphite drawings are. You can sharpen them. It's a much harder material, so you can get those very fine lines, fine details. There are different lead weights of graphite pencils, so some of them you use to get a softer, smoother texture. But when you look at these three, starlets, you can really get those crisp, fine details that you can't get with other drawing materials such as charcoal pencils. So charcoal tends to be more textural, more expressive. This is a link. It will talk to you a little bit about Kate Kulvitz, who used charcoal in really compelling ways to do a lot of self-portraits, a lot of work during World War I and World War II, about loss, about motherhood, about mothers experiencing loss. That was kind of the main theme of her work. But she uses this charcoal pencil here in a very expressive way. So she has this beautiful, soft, smudgy rendering of her face and of her hand. And then the connection is very kinetic through this use of these charcoal pencils. So she's really describing the medium to you and how she uses it. We also would consider pastels a drawing material, even though sometimes they can look a little bit more like paintings. So this is a soft crayon made of chalk and pigment. And also we call any work that's done in this medium a pastel. So if you were to say, what medium in this is this, you would say pastel on paper, for example. And Degas loved this medium because he could work very quickly. So he could do these studies. For example, he did a lot of studies of women bathing. And he often caught them in these very precarious, kind of awkward postures. We're used to seeing women in art represented in these very idealized forms, and here we have something quite different. And there's a lot of debate. Was Degas misogynistic? Did he not like women? I think he was actually very interested in the female anatomy and in the way the female body moves, and not necessarily in always the most beautiful settings, but kind of in that naturalistic way. And so by being able to do these in pastel very quickly, he could kind of catch these moments a little bit differently. And of course we have pen and ink as well. So, obviously a drawing technique which uses fine pointed instruments such as a quill or a ballpoint pen or a whatever it might be, combined with ink as a medium. So we have artists like Jean Dubuffet, and this is Corps de Dame, so this is Body of a Woman. And again, a very different interpretation of the female body. But you can see that he really lets the medium dictate. This is very clearly when you look at it, pen and ink. And I want you to consider, how do we know this is pen and ink? What describes that to us? How is this drawing conducive to using pen and ink? How does that help describe what this artist is trying to do? There's a lot of influence here with some of the abstract expressionists and some of the work they were doing. And ladies, I want you to consider this representation and how you feel about the female body being represented in this way. Okay, and then we have innovative drawing media that can be several different things. The one example that I've brought in is Henri Matisse's his scissor drawings, as we kind of refer to them as. And this one is titled Venus. And in his old age, he developed cancer. He was wheelchair bound, so he couldn't paint quite right the way he wanted to, being in this wheelchair. And so he, the guy had to keep working. And so he started to talk about, scissors could actually be a really successful drawing tool. That's how he referred to them, as a drawing tool. And so I want you to look at this and consider how the artist is using things such as positive and negative space, how he's using color, how he's using unity, and these really simple compositions. And I also want you to consider, we kind of have this theme going with the female body right now. What does this composition say about the female body? I want you to look at the title, and I want you to consider, where's her head? So what's being emphasized here? We have hips, we have breasts, we have this elongated neck. And we know that the Venus is, kind of a classical representation of idealistic beauty, not necessarily a personage with, a full personality, when we kind of refer loosely to a Venus figure. And so he's kind of reduced the female body to this form with no head. And of course, the head is where the personality lies. And so she's kind of being cut from that. I want you to just start thinking of these things when you look at these. What is being represented here, and in what way? And then just for fun, I've included this little link of an innovative drawing media, and I bet you've never seen art like this before. Okay, let's talk about printmaking now. So printmaking, in a way, is also a drawing medium. But we use a lot of different tools. So I'm going to give you some basic vocabulary here, and students tend to get confused with this, so I'll try to make it as clear as I possibly can to just let you understand this whole process, and if you ever hear these terms, how they relate to this whole process of printmaking. So printmaking, first of all, allows us to make multiple versions of the same work of art. So we could proliferate images a lot more quickly through culture. Instead of, looking at a painting that's hanging in a studio, if you had a print, it could be printed in books and newspapers and pamphlets and dispersed, right? So it was a pretty cool innovation when it did happen. Okay, so we have a print. This is any one of multiple impressions made from a master image. Well, what is an impression? An impression is a single example of an addition. So we're kind of building our vocabulary up as we go. So you have to think of an impression as the act of making the print, and the print is what results from that impression. Okay, and of course we have that master image that the artist created in the first place to make the impression from, that resulted in a print. And we also refer to this master image as the matrix. This is that, if you had the master image or the matrix from an iconic artist, that would be worth a lot of money, right? Because that's the original. The prints are all subsequent, reproductions, right? So the matrix is that master image that the artist makes an impression, which results in a print. So I'm trying to kind of build this up for you. And then we have this concept of an addition. So in printmaking, this is the number of impressions that are authorized by the artist, from a single master image. So say the artist authorized 100 prints or 100 impressions to be made in a series or edition, right? That's where we get that term edition. And they're usually numbered. If you ever get into collecting art, lower number editions are usually more valuable than higher number. So 10 out of 100 would hypothetically be worth more than 90 out of 100. And that has to do with, sometimes the matrix wears down after time and all that kind of stuff. Okay, we have this concept of an original print. So this is a print created by the artist alone and that has been printed by the artist or under the artist's direct supervision. So for example, that edition that an artist creates from their matrix, makes impressions, makes prints in an edition, those are all considered original prints. However, if the plates are passed down, for example, so say we had Goya's matrices, I don't know what the plural of matrix is. If we had that, his master image, and somebody today made a new edition, they would not be considered original prints because Goya is long dead. They haven't been authorized by the artist. So they wouldn't be worth as much money, even though they were made from the original. They wouldn't be worth as much money because they weren't authorized under that direct supervision of the artist. And then lastly, we have this term proof. So this is a trial impression of a print made before the final edition is run. So that way it can be examined and corrections can be made. Maybe colors are a little too heavy in certain areas or they need to be deeper. Maybe when you incise certain parts of the printing plate, it was too light. So these are kind of those proofs, those practice runs, so that an artist can then make the adjustments to create the actual prints to fill in an edition. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Please, let the instructor know if you're having trouble with that. Okay, so we want to talk about relief printmaking, and so this is a printmaking process. We're going to talk about relief, we're going to talk about intaglio, and we're going to talk about lithography and silk screening. So those are kind of the four main methods we're going to look at. And under relief, there's a couple different, subcategories. So a relief is any process in which the area of the plate that is being, used, that the area of the plate not to be printed is carved away, leaving only the original surface to be printed. So this gives you an example. So if we have this is from a woodcut. So you have to imagine that this black space is what the whole surface looked like originally. What is white is what was carved away, right? So when you make the print, you have this relief, this kind of jutting out, pieces that are inked, and then that's all that the ink sticks to, and that's all that gets printed. So that's why we call it a relief process. So the most well-known relief process would be woodcuts. So a relief printmaking process in which a wooden block carved so that those parts not intended to print are cut away, leaving the design raised. The resultant print is also called a woodcut. So like we would call something done in pastels a pastel, we call, a woodcut, something made from a woodcut, we call it a woodcut print. So this is Emil Nolda's, he had a whole series of woodcuts. This one is called Prophet, but they tend to be a little bit more graphic in nature. We have these kind of larger blocks of color. It's with woodcuts, there are artists who can get really crisp, fine, tiny details, but they tend to be these kind of larger masses of negative and positive space like we see here. And there are several other relief processes, but we're just kind of, giving you some of the basics. So there's, different versions of this, but we don't really have the time to get into all of them, or this lecture would be hours and hours long. Okay, so we want to look at intaglio printmaking. So this is different than relief printmaking. So where relief, we're cutting away and what is left raised is what we print on. With intaglio, we're incising into a surface, and that is the place that the ink adheres to that is actually printed. So it's that negative space, really, or that positive incision that is actually printed. And so we have a plate where the line is incised into the surface, and this includes different versions or different styles of intaglio, such as aquatint, dry point, etching, engraving, and mezzotint. We're only going to look at etching and engraving. But this gives you an example. So we can see the steel plate, we can see the engraved line, the ink goes into that engraved line. The printing pressure is applied with the paper. The paper, basically kind of deposits, or the ink is deposited onto the paper from that engraved space. I want you to be aware of one technique that we see in intaglio very often, which is called stippling. So we see this in drawing as well. But this is a pattern of closely placed dots or small marks employed to create the effect of shading or modeling. That way you can tell here in this sphere, for example, that where these stipples are very tight and close together, it's darker. Where they're looser and more spaced out, it's lighter. So we have our highlight here. We could tell our light source is coming from here. So this circle all of a sudden becomes a sphere because it's, again, goes back to that idea of modeling. So this is stippling, basically allows us to do light modeling with printmaking processes. Okay, so let's talk about engraving. So this again is an intaglio process, and we use a sharp tool called a burin to incise the plate. So this gives you examples of different types of burins that could be used to achieve different line qualities and shadows. And so it typically has a V-shaped point, and it's used to engrave. And so you would often, sometimes they would hammer it along, or if it's soft enough, you can kind of draw with it. But so you were engraving into a metal plate, and then this basically is how it would work, this process here. And we have Albrecht Dürer's Adam and Eve, very early engraving, very beautifully done, but done in this style. And then we have etchings. Rembrandt loved etchings. And this is a printmaking process, again intaglio, in which a metal plate is coated with a wax material, and then it's drawn upon with a sharp tool, such as a burin, and then it's submerged in a bath of acid. What happens is the acid eats into the plate where the lines have been drawn. So if you have this waxy material, you're drawing in this wax, so you're basically removing wax in certain areas. You submerge this plate into acid, and then where the acid only eats where the lines have been drawn, where that wax has been removed. So that way the acid is eating away at that plate, and the longer you leave it in an acid bath, the deeper those lines are going to get. And so then it's removed, the wax is removed, and it's inked and printed. So we call this waxy surface a ground that is applied to prepare it for etching. And then we have this term stopping out. And so this is an application of a varnish or a ground, so another chemical that we put on that etched surface to keep that acid from eating further into the surface. Or else if it kind of sat there and you didn't get all that acid off, over time it would actually keep eating away and deteriorating that etching matrix or master image. And so you can see here in Rembrandt's self-portrait where he's let the acid eat away a lot longer than in other places. And so this is a really complex technique because you would have to do certain portions of it first, submerge it in the acid, and then do other parts and then submerge it again to get some parts darker and let some parts stay lighter. So it's a very complicated technique, but gives us these really beautiful results. Remember, engravings and etchings, although very different, are both intaglio printmaking processes. Okay, let's talk about lithography. So this is a printmaking process in which a polished stone, often limestone, we draw on it with this greasy material called a touche, and the surface is then moistened and inked. The ink adheres only to those greasy lines of the drawing, and then the design is transferred to dampened paper, usually in a printing press. So that's, in a very small nutshell, how lithography works. It often gives us a little bit of a silkier texture. And here's our friend Daumier again, proving how printmaking was an early form of photojournalism. So this is Rue Transnonain, April 15th, 1834. So that's the full title. And it's really almost like a news headline title, just giving us the location and the date of this event. And there was an uprising. I'm giving you the very truncated version of this story. There was a political uprising, and the gendarmes, the police, were sent and basically massacred a bunch of people in their sleep that were kind of, political dissension, were causing this upheaval. Dissenters, that's what I was looking for. And so you can see this almost feels like an early snapshot or, forensic photograph that we have, this person lying dead in the background. We have this man here, and very sadly, we have a child here as well. And so these people have all been, killed in their home in this, really unfortunate event. And this is a true story. This isn't necessarily an exact scene, but this is based on what actually happened. And so because he did this as a print, he was able to proliferate this image and people were able to see it. Seeing an image like this is much more horrific than just hearing about it. And so this really helped ignite a lot of, things in us. And so having this printmaking process really expedited a lot of stuff in the world. So be aware of that, before we had photography, we had prints, and they were really useful in getting information out there. Okay, so we want to look at silk screens. This is our last printmaking method. You're probably like, thank the Lord, we're done with printmaking. And it's silk screens. So this is also known as serigraph, and it's a print made by the process of serigraphy. And this is basically an image transferred onto paper by forcing ink through a mesh. Areas not meant to be printed are blocked out. So you probably own t-shirts, you've got t-shirts in your closet that were probably done with a silk screen technique. And so you do one color at a time and you kind of layer them, and each screen has certain areas cut away where the ink will come through. And where other areas where it will not come through, and so we can get certain forms and certain colors. And Warhol was a master of silk screens. He used this technique very, very much in his work, and most iconically probably in his Marilyn Monroe images. And so we have one image on the left that's one larger, and of course he would kind of experiment with the colors, do some really interesting things with them. And then he would do what's called a diptych. So this is, a diptych is two, right? So we have two versions. We have a black and white, and then we have this color version, and he put them side by side to kind of give us this contrast. And the way he repeats this image over and over by using printmaking process, it talks to our consumption of the celebrity, and of this icon. It talks about, importance of kind of ritual, that when we see an image over and over and over, or we recite something over and over, it becomes this ritualistic experience. And so he's kind of bringing this together, this idea of celebrity and ritual and spirituality and religion, and kind of elevating these figures, kind of to a point of worship. And so he's really commenting on this quite a bit. And he also, on the flip side, is commenting on the fact that when we are so used to seeing an image over and over and over again, we get a little bit desensitized to it. So there's this interesting dichotomy that goes on, but he uses printmaking to really bring this point across. Okay, we're going to talk about painting next, and I do want you to be aware of one term here, didacticism, and this is an approach to making art emphasizing its ability to teach and particularly to elevate the mind. So when you're in a museum, when you see those little wall statements next to a work of art that have a little, blurb about the painting or the sculpture or the artist, those are called didactic statements. And so those are designed to help us learn something from these works of art. And painting often is very much associated with this idea of learning about the world, about our history, etc., exploring all of those things. Okay, let's get some of that basic vocabulary down. So we have a support, which is the surface on which the artist works, a wall, a panel of wood, a canvas, or a sheet of paper, whatever it might be. And we have what's called a ground. So this is a coating applied to a canvas, or we also have this term in printmaking. So this coating that prepares the painting or the etching or whatever it might be. It prepares the support to receive the material that you're going to be using. And then in painting, it's really important to know this term solvent and vehicle. These can be kind of synonymous at times. And this is something that thins out the paint, enables it to flow more readily, and it can also, we can use to clean our brushes. This is also called a vehicle because it serves to move the paint around the canvas, right? You have to thin out paint to get it to really kind of spread nicely. Okay, the first method we're going to look at is a very old one. This is called encaustic, and so this is a method of painting that used molten beeswax fused to the support after application by means of heat. And so you would use, get the wax really nice and melty. So this kind of served as our solvent so we would have the pigment, and the binder kind of becomes this beeswax. And what happens then is that it hardens into this really beautiful surface, and it becomes, the wax and the paint become one. So instead of painting and then putting a layer of wax over it, it all becomes a one surface. We see this mostly in ancient funeral portraits when the Romans inhabited Egypt. So this is from, these are considered the Fayum portraits, and they were on the actual sarcophagi or the coffins. And so basically there was a portrait of the person right there on their coffin. And I've gotten to see a few of these in person, and they are so rich and so beautiful and so expressive. And of course, there's this idea that the eyes are the window to the soul, and there's this real emphasis on the eyes here. And there is a link for you to learn a little bit more about this. We have contemporary artists, though, or modern artists, who use encaustic, so kind of bringing these ancient methods into the 20th century. And there's a link here for you to look at Jasper John's work, and he uses this very old method to give us his flags, and he did several versions of these. This one is 3 flags, and he's a very interesting character, as kind of giving us a very not bland, but just very approachable representation of this image, but very non-committal, also in a way of not really telling us what this is about, but just representing it. He was a pop artist, so there's also this idea, again with Warhol, about repetition and these images that we're kind of oversaturated with. There's this, he supposedly says that he had a dream that he painted the American flag, and so he painted it, and that's really as deep as it gets, which isn't really necessarily true. But he was really interested in the idea of symbols and the power of symbols, and how they really are just a set of, lines and colors on a paper, and yet we endow them with so much. And so he kind of is trying to leave this up to our interpretation here, but there's a link about this for you. Okay, let's talk about fresco, another very ancient form of painting. So if you ever get a chance to travel to Italy and go to Pompeii, you can see some of these frescoes, and a lot of the Roman frescoes were describing everyday life, and so we learned a lot about the people based on these images. This one's called Still Life with Eggs and Thrushes. So we have the birds hanging here on the wall. But fresco is painting on plaster. That's basically what we're doing. And we have 2 versions of fresco that I want you to be aware of. We have a buon fresco, or good fresco, or wet fresco. And this is where the painting is chemically bound to the plaster and is an integral part of the wall support. And the way this works is that you had to work in sections. You couldn't just, do the whole, plaster the whole wall and then start painting because the plaster would dry. So the idea is that you work in one section at a time, and the paint and the plaster, they kind of bind together and they become this one hard surface. So instead of, again, having, paint and then another material on top of that, or having plaster and then painting on the plaster, you have this, one surface. And so because of this method, these paintings tend to stand the time a lot better. Here, this is from 1305, and yet we still have really beautiful colors. It hasn't broken down as much as it could have. And so this, again, think of this good fresco stands the test of time because it was done wet on wet, wet paint, wet plaster, and it was, they bound together. And then we have fresco secco. So this is dry fresco. So this is where the paint is an independent layer separate from the plaster proper. So this is where you would plaster the wall, the plaster would dry, and you would paint on top of that plaster. Well, the problem is that the paint breaks down much quicker this way, especially in, humid Mediterranean climates, and they tend to just flake right off the wall. And Da Vinci's Last Supper is actually a great example of this. We knew about buon fresco. This is 1495. So this is done, gosh, nearly 200 years after Giotto's Lamentation, and look at the difference. There's actually only 20% of the original painting left on the wall because Da Vinci used this method instead of using buon fresco. And so there are restoration specialists who are painstakingly, millimeter by millimeter, trying to restore this, but it's really quite sad how much it's deteriorated. You can't even see anymore all the feet of the disciples. They'd be quite vibrant here. We've lost just so much detail. There's a beautiful replica of Da Vinci's Last Supper hanging in Oxford University, where the colors are much more vibrant, and we have an idea of what this would have looked like. And this was done in Da Vinci's time, this replica. So it will, if you want to look that up, you might be interested to see how different this would have appeared if we had been able to see it in its original glory. So again, remember, fresco secco, dry fresco, not good, flakes off the walls. Buon fresco, good fresco, wet on wet, adheres together, one hard surface, stands the test of time a lot better. Okay, let's talk about tempera painting. So this is a painting medium made by combining water, pigment, and usually egg yolk. And this serves as a binder for the paint. And it gives us these really beautiful kind of satiny finishes. Think of if you're painting your house, you've got flat paint, you've got semi-gloss, you've got eggshell. Eggshell kind of tends to have this, nice, not quite matte, but not quite glossy finish. It's kind of somewhere in between. And that's what we get with tempera paint. It's lovely, lovely texture for paintings. And Botticelli is well known for his tempera paintings. And there's a link for you to watch a little video about this painting. This is the Birth of Venus. You've probably seen this image before. I want you to really consider, especially the female body here, how she's kind of separate. This almost feels like a stage-like setting, and she's really kind of floating. Look at the way she's standing, her feet. It's, she almost appears weightless as she kind of floats in on this seashell. And we have the zephyrs who are blowing her in, and we have spring welcoming her, and of course now she has to be clothed because she's going from she's coming into the real world, but again we have this kind of representation of idealistic beauty, not necessarily an individual, but more of a concept and an idea. So another artist that uses tempera paint quite beautifully in the 20th century is Andrew Wyeth, and he chose this method because of that beautiful texture and finish that you could get, and it also kind of gave these warm, aged looking compositions. And so I want you to consider this painting, and it's a link as well. This is called Christina's World. You might have seen this before, and I want you to really try and analyze this and think, what is going on here? What is this about? What is the artist trying to communicate to us, and what does it say about, culture in the 20th century? Okay, let's talk about oil paint a little bit. So kind of that most well-known style of painting. And so we use linseed oil as a binder that becomes particularly popular at the beginning of the 15th century as we kind of discovered this. And what makes oil painting so popular and such a beautiful technique is that we can do something called glazing. And this is where we have layers upon layers of paint. Some are much thinner layers, and it allows the light to kind of bounce through, and these paintings seem to almost glow from within. So this gives you kind of a little idea of what this looks like. So we have, we have the cloth, we have a ground of plaster, and then we have these layers of paint. And this is an idea of what it would look like. So the underpainting might be quite heavy, and then as we get up, these glazes, these tiny thin layers get thinner and thinner. We kind of water them down as we go, because then you can see that these pigments they're more spread out, and so there's more room for that light to bounce through and to give us that beautiful glow that we associate with glazing. Okay, and then we want to talk about watercolor. And so this is a painting medium consisting of pigments suspended in a solution of water and a material called gum arabic that kind of binds it together but breaks down very quickly in water. And we would describe watercolor paintings as being very transparent. The colors blend very easily, and we get these soft washes. It's a very challenging technique because you have to learn how to manipulate it. And where the water kind of flows, the paint flows more freely. You can't really get, it's hard to get thick watercolor paint. It always kind of, you have to let it flow how it's going to flow. And Winslow Homer is a brilliant watercolor artist and did a lot of studies of the American landscape in these beautiful washes of color. So you don't tend to get as much fine, crisp detail, although some artists can do it and it's incredible to see, but you get these beautiful kind of abstract, soft washes of color when we see watercolor paintings. And then we want to look at acrylic, and acrylic is a relatively new method of painting. And this is, and it's because it involves plastic. So we have a plastic resin that when it's mixed with water and pigment forms an inorganic and quick drying paint medium. And so we have all these other methods are quite organic materials, and acrylic is really synthetic, isn't it? And so it dries quite quickly. So it's, those craft paints that you use as a child, those are 99% of the time acrylic paints. They dry quite quickly. And, this has its drawbacks and its benefits as well, so that you can work quickly, you can layer paint quickly, you don't have to wait for layers of oil paint to dry in between. And we see artists like Helen Frankenthaler experiment with acrylic paints in a really interesting way. She was part of the second wave of New York abstract expressionists in the 1960s. And they were really interested in the materials themselves and kind of letting them speak on their own. And so this is called flood. But what she did a lot in her paintings is she would let the paint flow over the canvas as it would. And so we really get the sense of the paint and how the paint works on its own. And there's kind of, a little bit of the idea of spontaneity and chaos that comes into this. But because she was able to layer these, because they would dry quickly, these washes or floods of color. Okay, let's look a little bit at mixed media and collage. And so we have, in mixed media, we are combining two or more medium in a single work. So it might be painting with collage, it might be sculpture with painting, whatever it might be. We have, mediums that traditionally tend to be separate, combined together. And then we have this term collage. So this is a work made by pasting various scraps or pieces of material, usually cloth, paper, photographs, onto the surface of the composition. And I've categorized mixed media and collage under painting because it has an interesting relationship to painting, because it violates the integrity of painting as a medium. And it does this by introducing into the space of painting, what we're used to seeing as painting, materials from the everyday world. So we could have easily painted these images, but by incorporating these actual materials, we're kind of saying something about painting, but also, saying something about the world around us. And so kind of violating that process. And it's a really interesting process too, because it allows us to engage with culture on a more intimate level. And so Hannah Hawk, who we'll look at later in the semester or the session, she did a lot of collage work, one of my personal favorite collage artists, and she combined text very often. She was very interested in the way women were represented in the media, which is a very hot topic today as well. And so she would use these cutouts from newspapers and magazines, but she would manipulate them. She would change them into something different and making a completely new composition from them. Okay, let's talk about photography and time-based media. And so this is going to be a very basic, broad introduction to this medium, but we'll do the best we can. And so we have the first recorded photographic image in 1826, 27-ish, what we've kind of figured out. And although we don't credit photography as being invented until about 1835, 1837, so this is an earlier image, and there's kind of a race to be the one who invented photography, and so there's some kind of crossovers and some different stories that go on behind all of this, but this is definitely credited as being the first photographic image. It was done with a camera obscura on a pewter plate coated with this material called bitumen of Judea, which was light sensitive. And so this is a camera obscura here. And so you can see that the image comes in, it bounces off the mirrors, and you would use this, artists would use this if they were painting a subject that was slightly far away, and if they wanted to be able to see that crisp, fine detail, because this would magnify the image, and so they could look at this and get those crisp details. Jan Vermeer was known for using a camera obscura often in his paintings. Well, what happens is artists use the camera obscura to fix an image. And this is the problem, is that you could see the image reflected here, but you couldn't fix it. You couldn't keep that image there. And so by using this light box and letting the light come through and letting that image come onto this pewter plate coated with this light sensitive material, we could actually fix this image. Of course, it took a very long time to expose this pewter plate, and we've lost a lot of detail. I'll show you, this is what the actual plate looks like. This is kind of a modified version of it to pull out some of that detail, but this is the actual plate and what it looks like, and this is a link for you to look at as well on that. And so we have, voila, photography is invented. We were able to fix an image. And the first real method that we recognize is called the daguerreotype. And this is one of the earliest forms of photography, invented by Louis-Jacques Daguerre in 1839. And so, again, that date is kind of questionable. When was photography actually invented? And this was on a copper plate that was polished with silver. And so this became light sensitive as well. And so this is one of his earlier pieces. This is Le Boulevard du Temple, and it actually, if you look at it and you think, okay, this is a Paris street, it must have been really early in the morning, there's nobody out on the street. Well, that's actually not true. The street would have been quite busy, but because these images took a very long time to expose, things that were not still were not captured because they moved, and so the light they created didn't adhere to these plates. except for this man here, credited as the very first person ever photographed. Of course, we have no idea who he is. And he was getting his shoes shined. And so he was standing still for this image. And so he was captured on this plate. And so this is what daguerreotypes tend to look at. This is a link for you to learn more about daguerreotypes. And here are a couple early daguerreotypes. This is Daguerre himself. So we were able, imagine for the very first time, you could capture your likeness and it could stand the test of time, and your grandchildren or great-grandchildren could see what you looked like. You could send these to people. You know, think about early on in history, if you were a prince in Spain and you were betrothed to a princess in Brussels, you usually didn't even meet before the wedding, and you were sent a painted portrait of them. And of course, paintings can be quite deceiving. So, you know, knowing what someone actually looked like was a little bit of an interesting idea. And so now all of a sudden we could capture our likeness, and it was one of the most important innovations that we see occur. I actually own a small daguerreotype. They're called mirrors with a memory because they're that pewter plate or copper plate, excuse me, with silver. They're very, very reflective, and so you're seeing the image of this person, and then you're seeing yourself reflected in this image as well. They're really, really beautiful. And so we have these early, you know, ways of capturing images. Of course, they still had their flaws. They took a very long time to do, and we started to innovate. Again, please keep in mind this is an incredibly broad, very basic introduction to the history of photography. And before there was cinema, because we're going to, you know, look at that a little bit, there was Muybridge and his studies of animal locomotion. So we were able to fix an image finally, but we haven't quite discovered the idea of a moving picture yet until Muybridge comes around. This is 1887. This is called a collotype print. They were much quicker, clearly, because what he did, and there's a link that will show you more of these, is he was able to capture very quickly these images of animals in motion. And there was a big scientific debate about how horses ran. People believed for a long time that they ran like this, that all four legs left the ground, but in this kind of sprawled out motion. And because they moved so quickly that we couldn't really slow it down. And, you know, in today's world, we're very used to kind of, we understand how a horse moves. But I think before we had slow motion cameras and all that jazz, we didn't know because they ran so quickly. And so this is kind of what we thought they ran like. And Muybridge proved that that's not really true. And so we're able to see that, yes, all four legs do come up off the ground, but if you look at this one here, you can see it's not in this kind of silly sprawled out motion, but kind of, you know, much tighter. And so we were able to capture this and see animal locomotion, human locomotion. And from the beginning of photography, it's been associated very much with science and innovation. Photography actually at first was not considered an artistic medium, even though we're so used to it being an artistic medium today. When it was displayed in the World's Fair, for example, it was put with the science innovations, not where all the artwork was, because that's really what it was considered, the scientific innovation. It wasn't until a little bit later that we started to see artists, photographic artists emerging. And we do have some very early ones of some very beautiful work. But photography does, of course, eventually emerge as a very important medium of artwork. And here's another example. So we can see that, you know, the legs come off the ground, but it's in a much tighter fashion. Okay, so let's look at an important innovation by Ansel Adams. This is called the zone system. So this is a framework for understanding exposure. So basically what we have is, if you're familiar with photography at all, is this is a light meter. So if you look in the camera, this is what you're going to see. We have 0, we have positive 1 and 2, and negative 1 and 2, which is basically overexposing and underexposing an image, right? And so then we have this zone system here, and this is basically a photographic grayscale, and so it breaks it into these zones so we can tell, okay, Maybe if we want something to be slightly darker, we might want to not expose it to so much light, which underexposes it, which gives us a darker image. If we overexpose, it tends to get really blasted out and bright. And so this helped us and photographers to be able to, figure out where they wanted their image to lie. If they wanted it to be right there, kind of perfectly exposed, or if they wanted it to be slightly under or slightly over. This also helps when you are developing a print. And so we have this idea of dodging and burning. And we have this beautiful image called Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. And we can see the moon here and this beautiful black silky sky with some clouds, bright white clouds on the horizon. And then we have all the detail here of the landscape. We've got the mountains in the background here. And this is actually, manipulated slightly. When we dodge, we basically decrease the exposure of selected areas of the print that the photographer wishes to be lighter. So that way we can kind of pull out different, lights and darks, and burning does this as well. So this is a technique where we increase the exposure to where we want it to be darker. So basically we burn this area. So if you have your photo paper and you have it in an enlarger and you're going to expose the negative onto your photo paper in a dark room, right? Basically, you might cover this area here and let this burn, let it be exposed longer so that it gets darker, right? And then the opposite would be true of dodging. We might dodge certain areas, and so that it isn't as exposed as long, and that way it will be lighter. And so these are important innovations that Ansel Adams is known for, this zone system, and there's a link here for you about this that really explains why this is so important. Okay, let's talk about cameras and break down how they work. So this is called an SLR camera. This is single lens reflex, and we're going to just look at the basics. And so we have, this is in viewfinder mode. So this is if you're looking through your viewfinder. So we're not, if this is our film or our sensor, if it's a digital one, it's not being exposed yet. It's being blocked so that the light doesn't reach it. There's this mirror here. That basically the light comes in through the lenses, and this is called the aperture. This is an opening that opens to let the light through. It bounces off the mirror, off this prism here, and through the viewfinder. So even though your lens is down here and your viewfinder's up here, you're able to see what is coming through. So when we're in picture taking mode, this mirror flips up, and then the image is exposed right here onto the film or the sensor. And so there are different ways that we can control light when we're using a camera, and the two main ones are aperture and shutter speed. So the aperture is the opening that determines the quantity of light that is emitted by a camera lens. So it can either open a very tiny bit or it can open a lot. And so this is called f-stops in photography. The f-stop is how wide or how small the aperture opens. So if we have a low number f-stops, such as 2.5, for example, it's going to open a lot wider. If we have an f-stop like f16, it's going to be very tiny, and it's not going to let as much light in. This also can affect how much depth we can get in a photograph, this use of aperture. So the other way we control how much light we let in through the camera is the shutter speed. So this is the speed and length that the aperture stays open. So if you have it set at a f2.5, for example, it's going to open very wide. But if you have the shutter speed set to open very quickly, it's going to open wide but quick, wide and very fast. Or if you want it to open for a much longer time, you can let a lot more light through. And so this, again, determines how much light is admitted through the camera, which is going to determine if we perfectly expose, if we underexpose, or if we overexpose. So that is your very brief lesson in photography. Let's talk about reality versus imagination in photography. And this is one of my favorite topics to discuss. And it's this concept that, we have these terms, the camera never lies, right? That it captures the real world, that it can't help but capture its subject. It can't manipulate it, right? Well, that's not really true because there's human intervention that takes place. There's a photographer, right? And so the images are being dictated by the photographer. What's included, what's not included? Is it underexposed? Is it overexposed? Remember that a camera doesn't see the world exactly how our eyes do. Light tends to be a little bit different. Colors can be different in a camera. But there's also this concept, because we're so used to this idea of reality, that photos capture it, that we can manipulate reality. We can use photographs as propaganda. We can use them as marketing. And we can kind of tell lies with a camera. And an example of this is Timothy O'Sullivan's work. And what happened is he was a war photographer in the Civil War. And while he was trying very much to capture the horrors of the war in an accurate way, sometimes he would manipulate them. He would pose bodies, he would move them around, maybe put a gun in this one's hand to create a more compelling scene. And so, while yes, he's still representing the actual horrors of war, these were corpses, these were men who died, he's still manipulating it and disrupting reality in some way. So I want you to consider how this changes our notion of reality. Let's talk a little bit more about moving pictures now, and we have Thomas Edison's kinetoscope. So this is the first moving pictures, but it was very heavy, clunky, and expensive, this machine. It looked like this, and basically there was this whole pulley system, and the images would kind of cycle through and come up, and you'd look through this viewfinder, and they'd come across here, and they'd move very quickly. It was very, very loud, but you could see these, these dancing women or whatever they might be. And so it was very expensive for people to view it because the machine cost so much to build. And so we have these guys named the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis, and their father actually saw the kinetoscope and said, you guys can do better. And they are the ones that are credited with creating cinematography, or they called these actuality films. They improved Edison's design, made it lightweight, made it mobile, and so they could basically create moving images. So they weren't posed in studios, with one machine that had to stay stationary. They could go out in the world and they could, set it up and capture the real life. And so we call these actuality films. The first of these was projected in Paris in 1895. And this is a poster from one of their exhibitions or their theatrical performances. And this specific one, it was kind of a comedy, and it was, a man, watering the lawn, and this boy comes along and he, kind of closes off the hose so the water doesn't come out. When he puts it in his face to look and see where there's no water coming out, the boy releases it, sprays him in the face, and then he, gets his ears boxed or something. And it was supposed to be very funny. But some of these, people, they didn't really know how to react to them. There's one of a train pulling into a station, and the story goes, I don't know how true this is, but that people ran out of the theater screaming because they thought a real train was going to come at them through the theater. They didn't understand this concept of a moving picture. And imagine being someone who got to sit there in that theater and see moving pictures for the very, very first time. We're so used to them. We're so saturated with moving images that we just don't even think twice about it. But there was a time when this was an innovation. And this is a link, and you'll get to see some of these early films. And then we have guys like Georges Méliès, who really brought theatricality to cinema. If you've seen the movie Hugo, it's actually, not to give it away, but it's about Georges Méliès and his films. And he created these elaborate sets, and he came up with some really interesting, tricks of the camera that we still use today. He was the first one to figure out, if you paused the camera and everyone stayed very still, you could, take people out or put people in, and they could kind of just magically appear on film. But beautiful costumes, elaborate sets. This one is a link, and it will show you a clip of this trip to, I think it's called Trip to the Moon, which is actually on Netflix right now. You can watch the whole thing. This is Mélier's face here, and he, again, these elaborate costumes and staging. And he would have things kind of softly fade away and appear and smoke, and really interesting, beautiful techniques. But again, it was bringing theater into cinema for the very first time. There are a couple photographic or cinematic techniques of editing that I want you to be aware of. And a lot of them come from this film called The Birth of a Nation, which was, now we consider it to be incredibly, horrifically racist. It was basically about the Ku Klux Klan, but glorified the Ku Klux Klan. And so while the subject of the film is something, definitely to be studied with historic perspective, the techniques that were innovated in this film are really important. And there is a link to show you a clip of that film. And the techniques I want you to be aware of are panning, travel shot, cross-cutting, and flashbacks. And these are all done, and I'll let you read through those on your own just for sake of keeping this a little bit shorter, of how those work. But be looking for some of them in this film clip. Another important innovation editing technique was in a film called Battleship Potemkin, which was by Sergei Eisenstein, originally done in 1905. But it's called a montage scene. And so this is where we have these kind of disparate images, different storylines going on that you can edit together to kind of give us this multifaceted story of something, of these, different stories that are all happening at once. And so we can, instead of focusing just on one, we can see a broader picture. And so there's a very famous scene called the Odessa Steps that I've given you the link to. It's very overly dramatic. Keep in mind, this is early Russian film, and very, very, very dramatic. But you can see this idea of a montage and how powerful it becomes. I also want you to be aware of the film auteurs. So this is a film director who's considered the author of their work. So someone who's very well known for a certain style. So someone like Wes Anderson, for example, we would consider an auteur. You can usually tell Anderson's work when you see it because it's stylized in a certain way. Steven Spielberg, Ron Howard, all these guys, we would consider it to be auteurs. They have a certain style that they've developed, and they really, become that important figure behind the film. And then I also want you to just be aware of the fact that in 1927, we have the first feature-length film with synchronized sound and dialogue. And so this is The Jazz Singer, which starred Al Jolson. I've included a scene from this. This is the very last scene of the movie. Also considered very un-PC now because he's in what's called the blackface. His face is painted to look like he is of African descent, and he's singing this song called Mammy. But, there was a lot of thought that, oh, this was going to be, kind of a fad. It wasn't really going to stick, and of course it did. So very innovative, this first film, The Jazz Singer. And then, of course, we have animation as well. I've included this link. This is not something you have to watch by any means. It's a full-length documentary on early history of animation. And so we have this kind of combining of multiple mediums where we have, drawing, coming to life, and, in this rapid succession of moving drawings, and that gives the idea of live motion, of course. And Steamboat Willie is one of those iconic early cartoons. Let's talk a little bit about performance art. This is a form of art that's popular especially since the 1960s. Includes not only the physical space but also the human activity that goes on within it. And so I've included just a few examples of performance art. The concept too was that being there and being a part of the artwork was really important. Audience participation, audience reaction was incredibly important to this work. The idea that, it was temporal, that it didn't last, that you had to kind of be there to experience it. was really important. Sometimes they involved humor, sometimes they were quite erotic, sometimes they were violent. But the idea was that they, really, involved the viewer very much in their work. And so I've included some examples of these for you, and if you click on them, you can watch some of these clips about these early performance pieces. And some of them were even funny. These are my favorites. William Wigman did some very interesting, very dry sense of humor, but commenting on commercialism. There was always some underlying theme going on, even though they were very lighthearted. Uh, and so, some of them would be very serious and dramatic and abstract in their nature. Some would be very political. But again, it was this kind of new innovation of work that involved the human body. And let's go ahead and talk about sculpture. Okay, so some terms I want you to be aware of are subtractive and additive. These are kind of the two basic forms of sculpture. And let's look at subtractive first. So this is kind of like relief, and we're going to actually talk about relief style sculpture in just a second. So this is a process in which form is discovered by the removal of materials by such means as carving. So for example, if we look at this set of hieroglyphics here, we know that we originally had a flat surface, material was taken away, and what is left over is the image that we're left. So this is a subtractive. It's taking away to produce an image. And then an additive process is just the opposite, basically where forms are built up, they're shaped, they're not carved from anything, they're built up from nothing, basically. So it's the addition of materials that create a work, and this is Auguste Rodin's Burghers of Calais, which if you're in California and you go to the Norton Simon Museum, they have many reproductions of Rodin's work, and the Burghers of Calais is there. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous piece. So that we have subtractive and additive. And so subtractive techniques, we have relief in printmaking, we also have relief in sculpture. And so this is sculpture in which images and forms are attached to a background and projected off it. And so we have, this is obviously a subtractive method. So we're taking the material away for this image to emerge. And we have, in relief, we have what's called low or bas relief, and we have high or haute relief. And basically the difference is that low relief, the figures, they remain very attached to the background, and they only project by less than half of their normal depth. And so we can see that we get just about half of the body, right? It's, that's what's projecting from the wall here. And so we call this a low relief. This would be considered low relief too, right? It's not quite three-dimensional. It's not really projecting very far from the surface. And then we have high or haute relief. And this is a sculpture in which the figures and objects remain attached, again, to the background, and yet they project by at least half their normal depth. So we can see that we've got almost all of Washington's head, right, emerging from Mount Rushmore here. And a fun fact about Mount Rushmore, it was actually never finished. It was originally meant to have their torsos as well, and you can actually see Washington's shoulder here and the lapels of his coat. And so they were all supposed to be kind of, from the waist up, but it just was never finished. It was incredibly expensive. It took over 10 years as it was. It was a father who started it, and his son is the one that finished it, but then they ran out of funding. But so we see, we can tell this difference by high relief projecting more from the surface, low relief less than half of that figure's depth. Let's talk about in the round. So as opposed to a relief where you have to view it basically from one side, from the front, in the round sculpture, you can walk 360 degrees around it and experience it from all sides. So the artist has to really consider every single angle instead of just that one angle from, that front view with a relief sculpture. We also want to think of this as an environment, so the sculptural space, or the space, I'm sorry, that the sculpture occupies has to be large enough for the viewer to move around in it. So we refer to this to the environment of the sculpture. I also want you to be aware of this term contrapposto, which was a technique that was innovated by the Greeks. And it's this disposition of the human figure in which the hips and legs, they're turned in opposition to the shoulders, and we have this kind of counter positioning. That's what contrapposto means, it's counter position. And so we get this much more relaxed posture. You can see how the hips are kind of angled this way, the shoulders are angled in another way. We have the legs kind of more relaxed. This is actually a Roman copy of the original, and you can tell it's a Roman copy because of this little bar right here. The Greeks never had to have these little support systems, and we don't really know how or why, but the Romans hadn't quite figured everything out, so they had to have these other systems to help support the sculptures, and you'll see these often in Roman replicas of Greek originals. But I want you to be aware of that. Look at this kind of nice, curve of the body. It's much more relaxed. It's much more naturalistic than kind of this very austere, straight standing, stoic, figure. Okay, let's talk about another sculptural technique called casting. This is the process of making sculpture by pouring molten material, often bronze, into a mold bearing the sculpture's impression. And so we call this also a replacement process. And so you can look at this chart and kind of see how this works, that you're replacing one material with another. There's a link about how this works. We see casting in a lot of cultures, very beautifully in African cultures. This is from the Edo culture in Nigeria. In the court of Benin. Benin was a kingdom of Nigeria, is a kingdom of Nigeria. And this is the head of the Oba. The Oba is kind of, the deity, the priest, the kind of king type figure of this culture. And really beautiful cast of bronze image here. Let's talk about assemblage. We're almost done. This is an additive sculptural process in which various and diverse elements and objects are combined. So this is Robert Rauschenberg here. This is one of his most iconic works called Monogram. And he actually called these combine paintings. And so his idea was taking the painting off the wall and disrupting the way we, the viewer, interact with the work of art. We're used to having kind of the space of the painting and then the space as the viewer, right? That these are two distinct spaces and that we interact with it, but at a distance, right? So what he's done by taking the painting off the wall is he's putting the painting in the viewer's space that we occupy and forcing us to change the way that we interact with it. He also was interested in the Dada artists, who everything was very much about the absurd, about chaos, about coincidence and accident, and randomness, and he kind of gives us this almost, comical approach. There's a little bit of satire and humor here with this Angora goat that has been painted that has a tire around it. So again, there's this idea of kind of disrupting space and disrupting how we interact with the painting. But we have an assemblage, right? Because we have a painting and then we have other materials or objects that are combined with it. And again, Rauschenberg himself called these combined paintings. And then I want us to look at installations. So this is an environment that is indoors, right? So a sculptural environment that is all inside that we, the viewer, get to walk through and interact with. This is Kara Walker's work, Instruction. Our tools were rudimentary, yet we pressed on. This is an installation she did in 2000, and she does this incredible work with paper silhouettes and light projection. And what would happen is as you were walking through this, the way the light was projected is you would actually see your silhouette projected onto the wall. So you became a part of these scenes. She's very interested in the antebellum South especially, and the slave trade and the cultural ramifications of this, and how we think we're so distanced from it, but we're not. A lot of her work is very graphic and sometimes crude in nature, explicit in nature, but very compelling at the same time. So I have a link for you to follow that will show you some of her work. But very interesting, this idea of kind of making us, the viewer, a part of this and having to consider our role in this part of our history. And lastly, we're going to look at an earthwork. So an earthwork is an environment that is out of doors, right? A sculptural environment that takes place outside. This is a very iconic piece called Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. It's at the Great Salt Lake. You can still go see this today. He built it in 1970. And at different times of the year, it changes. As the water levels rise and fall, as the weather changes, the way this work looks changes. Sometimes it's completely underwater. And so the concept is, in a way, that you release this work to the natural world, and it can change based on Mother Nature. And so there's a link for you to watch on this as well. Earthworks are really kind of cool, interesting pieces. So that is really, I know that was a long lecture, but quite a broad introduction to this idea of mediums and methods, just to give you kind of that grounding, knowledge of some of the ways that artists use materials to tell stories, to engage with viewers, to stir controversy, to stir us, to religion, all these ideas. The mediums are a really important part of that, and how we as viewers react to these mediums is an important part.